In the quiet dawn of 60 BC, when the mist still clung to the river valleys of ancient Gaul, the land was not a single nation but a living mosaic of tribes, each with its own customs, its own proud memories, and its own sense of destiny. Across forests and mountains, from the cold line of the Rhine to the restless tides of the Atlantic, Gaul breathed as 1,000 voices, each speaking for its people, its ancestors, and the soil beneath their feet. Across these vast stretches lived the Celtic tribes, bound not by a shared government but by old stories and older traditions. Their boundaries were drawn not with ink but with sacred groves, winding rivers, and memories of battles long past. Alliances could rise like summer storms and collapse just as quickly. A feast might bind two tribes together for a season, while a single insult, forgotten by outsiders, could reopen wounds that older generations remembered with painful clarity. Among these many confederations, none held such prestige as the Aedui. They occupied the lush lands of what is now Burgundy, their influence stretching through the upper Loire Valley. Their stronghold by Bracte sat high on the slopes of Mont Beuvray, a place where forests murmured over ancient stone walls and traders from every corner of the known world passed through its gates. Here, amphorae of wine from the Mediterranean were traded for Celtic metalwork, amber gathered from northern shores, and the labor of captives taken in war. The Aedui had long practiced the delicate art of diplomacy, with Rome earning titles of friendship that carried both honor and quiet dependence. Yet power never exists in a vacuum. Eastward, among the harsh cliffs and winding passes of the Jura Mountains, the Sequani watched their neighbors with resentment hardening like iron within them. They controlled the gateways between Gaul and the Germanic world beyond the Rhine, ancient corridors through which traders, warriors, and rumors flowed. To them, Aeduan dominance felt like a shadow cast too far and too long, and they sought ways to break from it, reaching outward for new alliances that would one day reshape the balance of Gaul. Farther south, the rugged Massif Central sheltered the proud Arverni. Once the greatest tribe in all Gaul, their power had been humbled decades earlier by the armies of Quintus Fabius Maximus. But defeat had not erased their spirit. From their fortified capital at Gergovia, perched on its commanding plateau, they watched the valleys below with fierce independence. Their warriors, shaped by the mountains themselves, were renowned across the land. The strength, honor, and the memory of what they had once been kept the Arverni unbroken. To the east, the Helvetii lived in the sweeping alpine valleys of what is now Switzerland. Their lands were rich, their people disciplined and industrious. But pressures mounted, populations grew, and Germanic tribes pressed from the north. Among their leaders, discussions began to stir, quiet at first, then louder, about the notion of leaving their homelands behind in search of a new place within Gaul. Their deliberations, carried across smoky halls during long winter nights, would soon ignite events far larger than they could have imagined. And yet these powerful confederations were only a part of Gaul's vast tapestry. Dozens of smaller tribes filled the forests, coasts, and river valleys, each with its own traditions and ambitions. In the north, the Belgae, hardy, relentless, forged by constant clashes with Germanic neighbors, were feared throughout Gaul. Tribes like the Nervii, Eburones, and Remi valued courage above wealth, discipline above comfort. To them, life was a cycle of raids, defenses, and unending vigilance. Their lands were cold, windswept, and harsh, but so were the warriors they produced. Along the Atlantic shores, the Veneti commanded the waves with fleets that pierced the horizon like dark wings. The skilled sailors and shrewd traders, they connected Gaul to Britain, Iberia, and lands beyond. The Santones, controlling vital river mouths, formed another link in the network of coastal power. Their ships, carved from ancient forests, carried goods, stories, and influence across the sea lanes of the West. Throughout Gaul, alliances shifted like sand. A marriage between nobles might change a political map overnight. A successful cattle raid could spark years of conflict. The discovery of a new mineral vein might cement a tribe's prosperity or ignite a rival's envy. Without a central authority, decisions rested with assemblies where druids, nobles, and free men spoke for their people. These councils were where destinies were shaped, slowly and deliberately, beneath the watchful eyes of ancestors. Rome, however, watched everything. For decades it had spread its influence northward. The conquest of Massilia's lands had allowed the establishment of the province of Gallia Narbonensis, a foothold from which Rome extended its reach. Narbo Mardius, founded in 118 BC, grew into a bustling crossroads of cultures. Roman merchants bartered with Gallic traders. Craftsmen from across the Mediterranean showcased their work. Soldiers passed through on their way to far campaigns. Roads paved with Roman discipline linked the settlements, allowing travelers, goods, and armies to move with a speed Gaul had never seen before. Bridges spanned rivers once impassable. Harbors welcomed ships of staggering size, and Roman law began to mingle with Celtic custom. Many Gallic elites married into Italian families, blending traditions and forming delicate bonds that tied them closer to Rome. As the years passed, parts of southern Gaul changed, not through conquest, but through the soft pull of trade, comfort, and opportunity. But where Rome's influence grew peacefully, Rome's ambitions grew forcefully. And at the center of those ambitions stood Gaius Julius Caesar. In 59 BC, Caesar's political career stood at a precipice. His consulship had been marked by fierce conflicts, bold laws, and the ire of conservative senators. His alliances with Pompey and Crassus had given him power, but also obligations. His debts, monumental, crushing, threatened to unravel everything he had built. Only a great command, rich in spoils and opportunity, could save him. And Gaul, divided, wealthy, and restless, offered everything he needed. The Celtic druids, guardians of law and memory, formed a spiritual network that stretched across tribes. Their teachings of immortality, courage, and sacred duty shaped the minds of warriors and nobles alike. Their influence ran deep, and their unity, invisible yet firm, made them a challenge for any foreign power to break. The warrior aristocrats, proud and bound by honor, commanded loyalty through courage and generosity. Their halls were filled with feasts, their retinues with young warriors eager for glory. In their hands lay the strength of each tribe, strength that could be swayed, manipulated, or turned toward opportunities promising wealth and fame. Across Gaul, power lay scattered like embers, waiting for a wind strong enough to reshape the fire. Caesar saw that wind, and the tribes of Gaul, though unaware, were about to face a force that would change their world forever. The system of loyalty that shaped the tribes of Gaul, this intricate weaving of honor, generosity, and obligation, held their societies together like threads drawn through time. But the same bonds that strengthened them also made them fragile. When a renowned chieftain fell in battle or lost face before his people, entire coalitions that had seemed unshakable could unravel overnight. In Gaul, power was personal, not institutional, and the stability of large alliances depended on the charisma and reputation of a few extraordinary figures. Below the warrior aristocracy, the agricultural heart of Gallic society beat steadily. Fields carved from forest clearings, pastures stretching across hillsides, and villages of timber and earth provided the wealth that sustained the nobles who led the tribes into war. Farmers, herders, and craftspeople supported the grand displays of generosity that defined Celtic nobility. Feast halls filled with food, ale, and music served not only as places of celebration, but as arenas where influence was exchanged just as surely as gifts. Skilled artisans shaped metal into weapons of elegant curvature, jewelry in spirals and knotwork, and ceremonial objects that marked a noble's status. Their work traveled far beyond their homeland, carried along the trade arteries that connected Gaul to the wider world. Roman wine, Mediterranean glass, exotic stones, and unfamiliar goods from distant coasts flowed north, while Celtic craftsmanship, agricultural produce, and captives taken in war drifted southward and eastward in exchange. All of Gaul was alive with movement, goods, stories, alliances, rivalries. Yet beneath this apparent unity ran deep fractures. Shared language, shared gods, and shared traditions did not create shared political purpose. As every tribe guarded its pride, its autonomy, and the memory of past grievances. The absence of any single authority meant that when danger approached, responses were fragmented, each tribe watching to see what the others would do. It was this fragmentation, this lack of unity, that Rome recognized as an opportunity. And in early 58 BC, the opportunity came. High in the lands between the Rhine and Lake Geneva, where mountains rose like ancient teeth and valleys whispered with cold winds, the Helvetii stood at a crossroads. For years, their assemblies had debated a question with consequences too vast to ignore. Should they abandon the homeland of their ancestors? These debates took place beneath sharp alpine peaks, in councils heavy with memories of past victories and recent fears. At last, the decision was made. The Helvetii would leave. Not a portion of the tribe, not a single faction, but all of them. A people of nearly 368,000 souls would rise and march west in search of a new beginning. This was not a migration. It was the movement of an entire civilization. Records captured later by Roman hands revealed how thoroughly they had prepared. Leaders ordered a census, counting every man, woman, child, and elder. Livestock were accounted for, valuables were secured, supplies were gathered. Across Helvetian lands, granaries were emptied into sacks and wagons. Smokehouses worked without pause. Tools were repaired. Armor was reforged. The Helvetii were not simply moving. They were transforming. Germanic pressure from the north had pressed against them for decades. Tribes such as the Cimbri and Teutons had once swept through this same land like storms, and though Rome had defeated them, the memory of their fury lingered like a shadow over Helvetian borders. As each passing year brought more tension, more encroachment, more fear that their mountain valleys would no longer sustain them. Population growth compounded the problem. The harsh alpine world that had shaped them could not expand to meet their needs. Winter snows came early, spring thaw arrived late, and pasture lands could only support so many herds. The children of the Helvetii were growing up in a land whose limits pressed against them from every side. Their solution was bold beyond anything Gaul had witnessed. They had chosen the lands of the Santones near the Atlantic. a region of warmer winds, fertile plains, and access to the great maritime routes that reached Britain and the Iberian Peninsula. Getting there, however, meant moving across hundreds of miles of tribal territories, all of them with their own interests, pride, and delicate alliances. Vercingetorix, the wealthiest and most influential noble among the Helvetii, championed the vision. His cattle herds were immense, his political ties far-reaching. Through marriages, alliances, and persuasive power, he had convinced many that the migration was not only desirable but necessary for their survival. Under his guidance, preparations intensified. Craftsmen forged weapons day and night. Wagons were built in the thousands, sturdy enough to carry elderly travelers, young children, sacred objects, and the heavier burdens of Helvetian life. The supplies were stockpiled for months of travel. And then came the most dramatic step, the burning of everything they could not carry. Villages, homes, storehouses, even tools too large or too delicate to transport were put to the torch. The fires rose into the alpine sky, turning night into flickering daylight. It was a deliberate severing of the past. There would be no turning back. Smoke drifted for miles. Neighboring tribes watched with awe and unease. What desperation could drive a people to destroy their world? What force pushed them into the unknown with such total commitment? The answer echoed across Gaul like distant thunder. Something immense was moving, and nothing would remain untouched. When Caesar arrived to assume his command in Gallia Narbonensis, the reports reached him quickly. Allied tribes spoke with alarm. Roman merchants whispered about columns of wagons too numerous to count. The scouts brought tidings of towns left in ashes. Caesar listened, studied the maps, and immediately understood the magnitude of the threat. This was not a wandering tribe seeking pasture. This was a tidal wave of humanity, armed and restless, about to cross the fragile political landscape Rome had spent decades shaping. The most direct path the Helvetii intended to take ran between Lake Geneva and the Jura Mountains, a narrow corridor leading straight into Roman-controlled territory. If they were allowed to pass, the consequences would echo across the entire province. Caesar saw the danger clearly. If Rome could not control movement within its own borders, then its authority meant nothing. He acted without hesitation. His first order was the destruction of the bridge at Geneva. Roman engineers dismantled it stone by stone, plank by plank under heavy guard. What had once been a symbol of connection became a warning. Then Caesar ordered a chain of fortifications along the Rhone River. Earthworks, timber palisades, trenches, and watchtowers stretching nearly 20 miles. In a remarkably short time, the Rhone Valley transformed into a barrier of Roman will. The Helvetii, expecting negotiation or indifference, instead found themselves blocked by fortifications and denied passage. Confusion spread, followed by frustration, then by a search for alternatives. Caesar, meanwhile, explained his actions through carefully crafted diplomatic channels. To the tribes of Gaul, he portrayed Rome's intervention as protective, an effort to preserve peace, safeguard trade, and respect treaties. To Rome, he presented it as decisive leadership. Unable to cross the Rhone, the Helvetii turned toward the Sequani. Their only hope now was to convince this mountain people to allow passage through their narrow valleys and strategic passes. Negotiations began, complex, tense, and burdened by the unimaginable scale of what was coming. Across Gaul, the ground trembled not from war, but from the footsteps of a nation preparing to move. And Rome, watching intently, prepared to shape the future that followed. The mountain passes of the Sequani grew tense in the early months of 58 BC. Within their councils, the elders and nobles argued long into the night, weighed down by a decision that could determine their tribe's fate. They stood between two powers, one rising, one already established. On one side, Rome watched with cold vigilance. On the other, the Helvetian multitude pressed closer each day, a tide of nearly 400,000 souls determined to carve a path westward. No matter how the Sequani turned, they saw danger. If they refused the Helvetii passage, they risked war with a desperate people who had already burned their own homeland to ash. If they allowed the migration, they risked provoking Rome, a power whose roads, legions, and ambitions were steadily threading deeper into Gaul. Their debate revealed a truth that all Gaulish tribes knew. Choices were rarely between safety and danger, but between two different kinds of peril. The Helvetii, understanding the delicacy of their situation, broadened their diplomacy. Envoys moved through forest trails and river valleys, speaking with tribes that might sympathize with them, or resent Rome enough to see advantage in helping them. Among the first approached were the Tigurini, a people who carried memories of triumph over Rome like treasured heirlooms. Their ancestors had once ambushed and defeated a Roman army during the Cimbrian upheavals, and that victory remained a point of pride woven into their songs and stories. When the Helvetii asked for alliance, the Tigurini agreed. Another 36,000 joined the Great March, warriors hardened by tradition and families bound by the same hope for a new beginning. Their decision strengthened the Helvetian column and signaled that Rome might soon face something larger than a single migrating tribe. News of these developments reached Caesar through the sophisticated web of scouts, merchants, friendly nobles, and informants that fed him information day and night. The picture forming in his mind was no longer of a displaced people seeking refuge, but of a gathering coalition that could fracture Roman influence across the entire region. A spark in the west could ignite rebellion across all Gaul, and Caesar knew he had to suffocate that spark before it became a blaze. He moved quickly. Additional legions were summoned from winter quarters. Supply lines were fortified. Messengers rode out to Gallic leaders who owed Rome allegiance, reminding them of their obligations and warning against supporting the Helvetian cause. Caesar's diplomacy had a sharp edge, and every chief who received his envoys understood the danger of straying from Rome's expectations. Eventually, under mounting pressure and influenced by rivalries with the Aedui, the Sequani agreed to allow the Helvetii passage. Their decision arose from a mixture of fear, strategy, and opportunism. Helping the Helvetii might weaken the Aedui, longtime rivals for control of central Gaul's most profitable trade routes. And if the massive migration brought chaos, perhaps the Sequani could shape it to their advantage. But in granting passage, they also unknowingly ensured Roman military intervention. Caesar would not allow hundreds of thousands of armed migrants to move freely near Rome's frontier or across the lands of Rome's allies. Late in the spring of 58 BC, the migration began in earnest. Helvetian wagons creaked forward in long, rattling lines. Oxen snorted clouds of steam into the morning air, and the slow rumble of thousands of feet shook the earth. It was not an army with banners raised high, but a society on the move. Families traveled beside warriors. Priests walked beside herders. Children clung to the sides of wagons, staring out at a world they were seeing for the first time. The column stretched for miles, so long that those at the front could break camp while those at the rear were still preparing to sleep. Scouts watched the hills. Warriors guarded the flanks. As every stretch of road, every river crossing, every clearing became a temporary city, alive with cooking fires and murmured conversations beneath the open sky. As the Helvetii advanced, Caesar prepared. His combined force, Roman legions supported by Gallic cavalry loyal to Rome, moved with purpose, crossing the land not as wanderers but as a disciplined instrument of the Republic. When the Helvetii reached Aeduan territory, Caesar met them. There would be no peaceful passing. The confrontation that followed nearby Bracte would shape the destiny of Gaul. The battle was brutal, hard-fought, and decisive. A Helvetian determination met Roman discipline, and the result echoed across the land. The Helvetii, unable to retreat to the homes they had destroyed, were forced to fight for their very existence. When the dust settled and the wounded cried out across the slopes, Caesar had secured a victory that would be spoken of for generations. But even as he tended to the aftermath and reorganized his forces, a new wave of reports reached him. News that shifted the ground beneath his feet and cast a far larger shadow across the frontier. Beyond the Rhine, a new power had risen. Ariovistus, a Germanic king whose name carried weight like a hammer striking stone, had begun to reshape the lands east of Gaul. Years earlier, the Sequani had invited him to intervene in their disputes with the Aedui. What had begun as borrowed strength had become an occupying force. Ariovistus did not return home when the fighting ended. Instead, he stayed, bringing with him warriors from the Harudes, Marcomanni, Triboci, Vangiones, Nemites, Seleucia, and Suebi. These people did not arrive as raiders. They arrived as settlers. By 58 BC, nearly 120,000 Germanic men, women, and children had established themselves on Gallic soil. They built fortified villages. They cleared forests. They sowed fields. They governed themselves according to their own laws, ignoring long-standing Gallic customs. And they expanded constantly. The most dramatic proof of their rising dominance had been written at Magetabriga in 61 BC. There, Ariovistus, fighting with Sequani support, shattered the Aedui and their allies. The defeat broke the Aeduan claim to leadership among the Gauls. It also broke the confidence of countless smaller tribes who now saw Germanic power as something inevitable, unstoppable, perhaps even destined. From his base at Vesontio, Ariovistus ruled like a king. He demanded hostages from neighboring tribes. He ordered population shifts. He tore down sacred groves and replaced local traditions with Germanic practices. Young Gallic nobles raised in his household grew up speaking not their ancestral tongue, but the words of the Rhine warriors who dominated their lands. Trade suffered. Old routes that had carried goods between Gaul and the Mediterranean were disrupted or seized. New taxes were imposed. Germanic priorities replaced Gallic ones. Entire economic systems began to bend beneath the strain. As detailed embassies arrived in Caesar's camp, some from the Aedui pleading for protection, others from the Sequani confessing regret for the power they had unleashed, Caesar saw that this new problem was nothing like the migration of the Helvetii. The Helvetii had sought to pass through Gaul. Ariovistus had come to stay. This was no wandering people, no temporary tide. This was a new kingdom forming itself on Rome's doorstep. And Caesar understood immediately that if he did not act, the map of Gaul and the future of Roman power would be rewritten by Germanic hands. The defeat of the Helvetii and the growing unrest in eastern Gaul left the land humming with tension. Yet even as Caesar's legions marched northward and Germanic settlers tightened their grip on Sequani territory, a greater question lingered in the air: whether the Rhine, long viewed as a natural wall between two worlds, would continue to stand as a true frontier, or become merely a line on a map that stronger nations could cross at will. For centuries, the wide river had been more than water. It was a boundary of cultures, gods, languages, and destinies. On one side, Roman order spread through roads, cities, and law. On the other, the vast forests of Germania stretched beyond sight, home to peoples who valued strength above diplomacy and saw war as a trial that shaped a man's worth. But with Ariovistus now sitting firmly on the Roman side of the Rhine, the barrier was slipping. If he cemented his rule over the Sequani and spread his influence to neighboring tribes, the Rhine would cease to mean anything at all. Caesar saw this clearly. What unsettled him even more was that Ariovistus did not stand before Rome as a rogue invader, but as a recognized friend of the Roman people, granted his title by the Senate. What had once been a diplomatic gesture, intended to keep the peace, now threatened to unravel an entire frontier. Ariovistus, seeing himself as equal to Rome's greatest generals, had taken the Senate's recognition as a sign of approval. Each village he conquered, each Gallic hostage he demanded, and each new settlement carved into the land was carried out under the belief that Rome had already blessed his rise. But Caesar had not blessed it, and Rome had not imagined that its honor would be used as a weapon against its own allies. To confront this growing danger, Caesar had to tread carefully. He could not strike immediately, not against a man Rome itself had named king and friend. Before swords could speak, diplomacy had to. He sent envoys carrying messages crafted with both firmness and courtesy. Caesar acknowledged Ariovistus's status, but he did not hide his expectations. The Germanic leader must halt new settlements, return Gallic hostages, and respect the boundaries of tribes protected by Roman friendship. These were not threats, yet they were presented as reasonable terms that any honorable ally of Rome should accept. Ariovistus's reply came with the confidence of a man who believed the world was bending in his favor. He acknowledged Caesar's authority, but only over Roman lands. Beyond those, he claimed the right of conquest, earned through battle and bravery. He reminded Caesar that the Romans themselves had built an empire by taking lands from weaker peoples, just as he was now doing. And to Ariovistus, Caesar's objections sounded hypocritical, even insulting. More troubling, Ariovistus revealed a sharp awareness of Roman politics. He reminded Caesar that the Senate had approved his kingship and never protested his expansion. Perhaps, he implied, Caesar's demands were not truly the will of Rome, but the ambitions of one man seeking glory. It was a calculated insult, wrapped in political precision. Even as messages passed between them, both men prepared for war. Caesar strengthened his legions, gathering intelligence from Gallic nobles who feared Germanic dominance. Ariovistus called warriors from across the Rhine, swelling his ranks with men who followed him not because of treaties or diplomacy, but because he had led them to victory again and again. It became evident that only steel would decide the matter. Still, diplomacy had its final moment when Caesar and Ariovistus agreed to meet near Vercingetorix, the ancient Sequani town that now pulsed like the heart of the Germanic presence in Gaul. Caesar traveled there with his officers and protective escort, observing how deeply the Germanic settlers had reshaped the land. Farmsteads reflected new customs. Defensive outposts followed Germanic patterns. A prosperity flowed through villages built on the backs of tribute taken from Gallic tribes who once ruled these fields. When the two leaders faced each other, the air between them was thick with distrust. The soldiers stood behind each ruler, hands resting on shields and spear shafts, as though waiting for the slightest spark. Ariovistus argued first. His voice carried the certainty of a king who believed fate was on his side. He framed his rise as the natural order of strong nations replacing weak ones. He spoke of the Sequani's invitation as a binding agreement, payment owed for military protection. He claimed his rights were the same rights Rome had always claimed for itself. Caesar listened but did not bend. He answered with a vision not of conquest but of order. Rome had spent decades shaping alliances in Gaul, he said, building trust, stability, and trade. Germanic expansion threatened all of that. If left unchecked, it would ignite wars that would spill across the land and eventually threaten Rome itself. He insisted that the Rhine must remain a fixed boundary between their worlds. Their words were calm, their expressions were controlled, but underneath each understood the truth: there could be no compromise. When no agreement emerged, both leaders returned to their camps with the same understanding: the matter would be settled by war. Ariovistus would not yield, and Caesar would not allow Rome's influence to crumble at the edge of a river. The coming battles would decide more than territory. They would determine the fate of Gaul, the security of Rome's frontier, and whether Germanic power would spread like wildfire across the west. Ariovistus would be defeated, but his fall did not bring peace. As Roman legions settled into their winter quarters, news drifted in from the north, carried by merchants and trembling envoys. Beyond the lands of the Aedui and Sequani lay the territory of the Belgae, tribes hardened by cold winds, surrounded by enemies and untouched by Roman diplomacy. They had watched Caesar's victories with rising dread. If Rome had subdued the Helvetii and crushed Ariovistus, then the Belgae knew the Roman gaze would soon fall on them. Unlike many Gallic tribes, the Belgae had changed little across generations. Their warriors scorned Roman luxuries. Their nobles had no taste for Roman politics. Their borders were forged by raids, river crossings, and fierce independence. They had fought Germans. They had fought other Gauls. Now they prepared to fight Rome. Among them were tribes whose names carried weight throughout the north: the Nervii along the Scheldt, the Eburones under Avaricum, and many others who had shaped their lives around endurance, loyalty, and courage. The northern horizon began to darken with signs of rising alliances. Word spread that the Belgae, long divided by rivalries, might be considering something few had ever imagined: uniting against Rome. And Caesar, hearing these whispers, knew that another storm was gathering, one colder, sharper, and fiercer than any before. As winter loosened its grip on northern Gaul, the lands of the Belgae stirred with a tension unlike anything the region had known. The whispers of Caesar's victories traveled through forests, over rivers, and along hidden paths carried by merchants, envoys, and wandering storytellers. Every tribe listened, some with dread, some with anger, and some with a cold resolve to stand against the power that was creeping ever closer from the south. Among the Belgic tribes, the Remi stood apart. Positioned closest to territories already influenced by Rome, they had long practiced a cautious diplomacy. Their leaders had contacts with Roman merchants. Their young men had seen Roman coin, and their elders had heard tales of Roman discipline and strategy. Their familiarity with Roman ways did not make them allies, but it made them realists. They understood what many others still refused to admit. Rome did not roll back once it advanced. It dug roads, built forts, established alliances, and stayed. But the rest of the Belgic world felt the pressure more sharply. For generations, Belgic tribes fought each other, raided across borders, and defended their lands from Germans and Gauls alike. Their independence was not simply political, it was woven into their identity. No one commanded them. No prince or council governed them all. Each tribe carried its own pride, its own traditions, its own memory of battles won and lost. Yet now, for the first time, the tribes of the north began to move in one direction. Across windswept hills and dense forests, messengers traveled between tribal halls. The chiefs who had once faced each other on battlefields now clasped hands across tables of carved oak, swearing oaths for the sake of their people. Hostages exchanged hands, not as tokens of submission, but as symbols of trust. Marriage alliances were forged to bind clans and tribes together. The Belgic Confederation was born not out of unity, but out of fear of becoming the next chapter in Rome's relentless expansion. Winter saw iron fires burning day and night as smiths hammered out fresh blades, stronger spearheads, and thick armor plates. Warriors hardened by decades of border conflict began gathering supplies for a campaign they knew would test them as never before. Leaders prepared stores of grain, barley, dried meat, and fodder to keep their great armies alive on the march. Even the forest seemed to hum with anticipation as every settlement, large or small, contributed to a purpose greater than any one tribe. The Confederation did not act alone. Envoys crossed the Rhine, seeking Germanic warriors who might join their cause or create a second front that could slow Roman intervention. Diplomacy, long distrustful and harsh among Belgic tribes, became their sharpest tool. Caesar, however, was not blind to the storm building in the north. His intelligence networks, woven through merchants, allied nobles, and discreet Roman agents, brought him reports with alarming consistency. This was no small uprising, but a coordinated effort that threatened to dwarf the Helvetian migration and the might of Ariovistus. The numbers suggested by informants were staggering. If united, the Belgae could field more than 300,000 warriors, a force that outnumbered Caesar's legions many times over. And unlike the Helvetii, these warriors were not migrants. They were not travelers burdened with wagons and families. They were fighters, lean, disciplined, and forged in the crucible of constant conflict. The lands they controlled were equally significant. Belgic territory formed the crossroads of the northern world. Trade routes connected the Rhine to the Atlantic, bringing British tin, Baltic amber, and countless goods to the heart of Europe. Their coastlines offered promising naval footholds for campaigns into Britain or against Germanic seafaring peoples. Fertile farmlands fed their vast populations and promised rich tribute should Rome ever claim dominion there. But what set the Belgae apart was their spirit. Generations had grown up with war as a way of life. Their warriors fought with long slashing swords that gleamed like cold fire in the sun, heavy spears designed for brutal close combat, and large shields that allowed both protection and swift movement. From the Nervii to the Eburones, their reputation for fearlessness echoed across Gaul. Caesar knew what would happen if he allowed them to mobilize fully. If the Confederation gathered at its maximum strength, Rome would face its most dangerous challenge since Hannibal crossed the Alps. So he struck first. In the first breath of spring, as melting snow fed the rivers and the roads became passable, Caesar led his legions north. The Romans moved with speed and purpose, their formations slicing through the cold air like the tip of a gladius through cloth. Alongside them rode Gallic cavalry, tribes allied to Rome not from love, but from rivalry with other clans or the promise of Roman favor. The deeper the Romans pushed into Belgic territory, the more unsettled the region became. Some smaller tribes surrendered immediately upon seeing Roman banners cresting the horizon. They knew resistance would only bring ruin and hoped early submission might earn mercy. Their cooperation gave Caesar valuable knowledge of Belgic movements and preparations. The first real test came at Bibrax, a Remi fortress perched on a rise surrounded by forest and rivers. The fortress became the Confederation's first target, punishment for Remi diplomacy with Rome. Belgic forces gathered swiftly and encircled the stronghold, constructing earthworks and siege engines meant to overwhelm it through sheer force. Caesar moved to relieve the fortress, but instead of rushing into direct combat, he applied the methodical, calculating discipline that defined Roman warfare. His legions built fortified camps, ringed with trenches, stakes, and ramparts. Each camp was placed at a distance that threatened Belgic supply lines without exposing Roman troops unnecessarily. Night after night, the Belgic tribes hurled themselves at Roman positions. The air filled with war cries, thrown spears, and the heavy clash of weapons against shields. Their courage was undeniable, their attacks relentless, but their coordination faltered. The tribal warriors, each driven by personal valor, found it difficult to match the unified discipline of Roman legions. Slowly but steadily, the Belgic efforts began to fracture. News of failed assaults spread, and doubt slipped through their lines like a cold wind. Some tribes already whispered of surrender, others demanded immediate attack. Unity, once their greatest strength, now began to crack under pressure. The relief of Bibrax was more than a tactical victory. It sent a message ringing across the northern plains. Rome could resist the full force of Belgic fury and survive. From the forests to the marshlands, across long rivers and wide plains, Belgic leaders faced a difficult truth. If they remained united, they might still defeat Caesar. But unity was fragile and Rome was patient. As the legions prepared to march deeper into Belgic territory, Caesar received fresh reports. The Confederation was already splitting. Some tribes sought secret talks, hoping to secure favorable terms. Others argued for one final massive assault before Roman defenses became unbreakable. Their divisions would soon reshape the path of the war and open the door for Caesar to dismantle them piece by piece. The Belgic Confederation had fractured, its unity dissolving like mist beneath a rising sun. Roman dominance stretched across the northern plains, and the legions once again moved freely through Gaul. Yet even as Caesar tightened his grip on the heartland, troubling reports drifted from the western horizon. Reports that spoke not of scattered uprisings or tribal feuds, but of something far more elusive. A different kind of resistance was growing along the edge of the world. Beyond dense forests and rolling farmland, where the land broke apart into jagged cliffs and stone-bitten coves, lay the maritime world of Armorica. Here the wind carried the scent of salt and storms, and the sea was not merely a boundary. It was a shield, a highway, and a home. The tribes who lived along this Atlantic frontier were shaped by the tides, the fog, and the relentless rhythm of the waves. None embodied this sea-bound spirit more than the Veneti. Their people had watched Rome's arrival with sharpened suspicion. They knew the fate of inland tribes, the patterns of Roman negotiations, the roads that appeared like veins across conquered lands. But the Veneti possessed something the inland tribes did not: the ocean itself. Their power rested on the waters that churned around their rocky promontories, settlements built on stone outcrops that thrust into the Atlantic like ancient watchtowers. Many were connected to the mainland by narrow causeways of earth and rock. At high tide, entire towns could vanish behind walls of water, transformed into natural fortresses unreachable by foot. This geography made the Veneti impossible to besiege by traditional means. Their people simply retreated to their sea-ringed citadels, cutting the causeways and letting the tide rise between them and their enemies. And their ships, massive, towering vessels built from thick oak, were unlike anything Rome had ever faced. Where Mediterranean ships favored speed and maneuverability, the Venetic ships were made to survive the Atlantic's fury. Their hulls were deep and heavy, reinforced with iron and crafted to endure relentless waves. Their prows rose high above the water, allowing them to ride the swells instead of slicing through them. Their sails were fashioned from leather rather than linen, strong enough to withstand windstorms that would shred Roman rigging. These were ships built by people who lived their entire lives at sea, people who read tides like other men read the stars. Their trade network stretched north to Britain, south to the Bay of Biscay, and across the waters to distant Germanic coasts. For centuries, they controlled the flow of British tin, a resource coveted across the ancient world, and they guarded this monopoly with fierce determination. Roman merchants attempting direct trade with Britain had discovered this firsthand. Many were intercepted by Veneti patrols, warned off with stern diplomacy, or turned away by force. To the Veneti, the sea routes were sacred property, defended as fiercely as any homeland. When Caesar extended Roman influence toward the Atlantic, he unintentionally challenged this monopoly. And the Veneti responded with calculated defiance. They drew neighboring coastal tribes into a network of alliances, secured through marriages, shared wealth, and the unmistakable logic of mutual survival. Its inland tribes had been conquered because they fought Rome on Rome's terms. The Veneti intended to choose the battlefield themselves. They could not be surrounded like the Helvetii. They could not be outmaneuvered like the Belgae. And they could not be intimidated like smaller tribes that saw Rome as an inescapable force. The Veneti were something different. They were a people shaped by the sea and protected by it. Caesar understood this, and it troubled him. For all his victories on land, the Atlantic demanded a new kind of war. His legions could march, dig, and build, but they could not swim to island fortresses. They could not chase Veneti ships across churning waters. And they could not starve out a people supplied by the tides. To defeat the Veneti, Caesar needed a fleet. What followed became one of the most ambitious undertakings of his entire campaign. Shipyards sprang up along the Atlantic coastline, filled with Roman engineers studying Venetic design techniques with an urgency bordering on desperation. Local timber was harvested. Iron was imported. Leather sails were fashioned. Mediterranean shipwrights adapted what they knew, forging something new from the combination of Roman discipline and Veneti expertise. Every ship was built with one goal: to meet the Veneti on their own domain and overcome them. Caesar appointed Decimus Brutus, a commander known for both intelligence and daring, to oversee the creation of this new Roman navy. But the challenges were immense. Roman sailors had spent their careers in calm Mediterranean waters. Now they faced tides that rose and fell dozens of feet, currents that twisted without warning, and storms that could tear a vessel apart within minutes. Training was rigorous, exhaustive, and unrelenting. The crews learned to read the tides, to maneuver heavy hulls in violent surf, to brace against waves that towered over the bow. Every skill had to be mastered quickly. Time was not a luxury Rome possessed. Caesar also embraced innovation. His engineers designed long poles tipped with sharpened hooks, tools meant to tear down the thick leather sails of Veneti ships. Without their sails, the massive Atlantic vessels would become helpless against Roman maneuverability. This was more than an adaptation. It was a declaration: Rome would not be outmatched. When the Roman fleet finally sailed, its presence signaled a shift in the very nature of the war. For the first time, Rome was prepared to fight not on land, but on the open sea. The first major engagement occurred in the sheltered waters of Quiberon Bay, a place where tides collided like opposing armies and winds twisted unpredictably between cliffs and coves. The Veneti had chosen the ground, or rather, the water, believing their knowledge of the bay would give them the advantage. At the start of the battle, they were right. Their ships moved with confident grace, catching the wind and positioning themselves high above Roman decks. From their towering prows, Veneti warriors sent volleys of missiles crashing down onto Roman ships, using the sea itself as a weapon to control distance and momentum. The Romans responded with discipline, bracing shields, adjusting oars, navigating through unfamiliar waters as Brutus directed maneuvers with a commander's precision. The battle had only begun, but its outcome would shape not only the fate of the Veneti, but the future of Rome's presence along the great Atlantic frontier. The battle in Quiberon Bay shifted with a single brilliant moment of innovation. For hours the Veneti had commanded the waters, their tall ships riding the waves like wooden fortresses, their sailors guiding them with a mastery that came from a lifetime spent upon the tides. They had fought from high decks, sending volleys of missiles crashing down upon Roman hulls, confident that their leather sails and towering prows would continue to shield them from Roman attack. But then the Roman crews brought forth the weapons Caesar's engineers had crafted, long poles capped with sharpened iron hooks. The Romans maneuvered close, not to ram, not to board, but to reach upward. One by one, those hooked poles tore into the thick leather rigging that held the Veneti sails. The sound was sharp, tearing through the roar of the sea, a deep ripping like the cry of something ancient being wounded. The Veneti sailors lunged to cut the poles away, but it was too late. Thick ropes snapped, sails collapsed, and ships that once danced freely over the water suddenly went still. Their height, once an advantage, now became a curse. For the first time, the Veneti vessels, heavy, proud, and built for the rage of the Atlantic, sat helpless, motionless upon the sea. Panic spread from ship to ship as Roman galleys circled with new confidence, ramming the disabled hulls or seizing the moment to board with disciplined precision. The ocean itself seemed to shift allegiance. Within minutes, the Veneti formation fractured, Their oars could not turn their now sailless giants. Their famed seamanship was useless against ships stripped of the very tools that made them powerful. Waves crashed as the Roman fleet closed in from all sides, the battle turning into a relentless, methodical destruction of the maritime masters of Gaul. By the end of the engagement, the waters that once belonged to the Veneti were quiet. Broken hulls drifted, a few ships surrendered, most had been taken or sunk. Rome at last ruled the Atlantic coast. With the fleet destroyed, the rest of the Veneti world collapsed rapidly. Their coastal fortresses, once protected by causeways and tides, now stood vulnerable to Roman assault. Their ships no longer guarded the tin routes from Britain. Their trading power, built across centuries, vanished like mist in sunlight. Armorica, once a defiant region that thrived where land met storm-tossed water, now bent beneath the weight of Roman authority. But Caesar's gaze did not linger on the ruins of the Veneti. His mind was already turning outward, toward the gray horizon beyond the ocean, where the faint line of an unfamiliar island lay hidden behind fog and myth. Britons. Roman merchants had spoken of it only through stories filtered by Gauls. It was a place of strange customs, fierce chieftains, and mineral wealth buried in the earth. The defeat of the Veneti provided something Caesar had not possessed before. A ship strong enough to brave the Channel, crews trained in the Atlantic's ways, and information gathered from Veneti captives who traded often with the island tribes. Rome had conquered Gaul's seas. Now Caesar felt the pull of the unknown. The motivations were many. A new campaign offered fresh prestige, an achievement no Roman general had ever claimed. A crossing into Britain would stun the Senate, inspire the people of Rome, and silence political rivals whose envy grew with every victory carved into Gaulish soil. But there were practical incentives as well. Tin, gold, and untapped resources lay across the narrow channel. British tribes were rumored to hold great herds, fertile lands, and slave populations ripe for Roman markets. A control of Britain would complete Rome's dominance over northern trade and secure the edges of the known world under Caesar's command. So the preparations began. The channel was treacherous, its tides rising and falling with a violence that Mediterranean sailors had never seen. The storms came without warning. Hidden sandbars shifted beneath the waves. Even the coastline of Britain was unfamiliar, drawn only from vague descriptions and merchant tales. To cross such waters required something beyond bravery. It required reinvention. Roman engineers labored day and night to create portable bridges, compact siege engines, and supply systems that could travel with the fleet. The ships had to be reinforced for the churning sea, outfitted with loading ramps wide enough for cavalry to disembark in formation, and built with compartments to shield grain and weapons from relentless waves. Veteran legionaries were chosen for the expedition. Soldiers hardened by the Helvetii, by Ariovistus, by the Belgae. Men who had marched through forests and plains and fought battles that tested the limits of Roman endurance. Auxiliary cavalry units, light and swift, would scout the foreign lands, while engineers would carve order into whatever coastline they touched. Yet, as preparations neared completion, troubling reports reached Caesar. Some tribes in Gaul, though recently subdued, were stirring once more. Roads that had fallen silent after Caesar's victories now carried whispered rumors of rebellion. Chiefs who had once sworn loyalty were meeting in secret. The cost of leaving Gaul unattended suddenly loomed over the expedition like a dark cloud gathering above the sea. Still, Caesar pressed on. When the first expedition crossed the Channel, it was not meant to conquer Britain, it was meant to understand it. What they discovered shocked them. The British defenses were formidable, shaped by geography and honed by centuries of tribal warfare. Their chariots, unfamiliar to Roman eyes, tore across uneven ground with terrifying speed, delivering warriors directly into the fray before snatching them away again like spirits vanishing into the mist. The tides were harsher than expected, the beaches deceptive, the weather unforgiving. Rome had touched Britain, but only just. The reconnaissance had revealed the truth. A true conquest would require a force greater than anything Caesar had brought the first time. More ships, more supplies, more men. A fleet built not for reconnaissance but for domination. And so, as year drew into year, Caesar began planning something far larger. A second expedition, one that would not merely touch the island's edge, but carve its name into Roman history. Engineers designed new transport ships with low profiles to avoid British missiles, stronger hulls to survive repeated groundings during landings, and reinforced interiors to hold siege equipment, cavalry, and entire legions. These vessels were not adaptations, they were inventions, built to tame the Channel, built to carry Rome into a land still shrouded in fog and legend. And when they were ready, Caesar's gaze returned to the sea once more. A threshold had been crossed. Gaul lay mostly subdued behind him. Britain waited ahead. And Caesar, whose ambitions stretched as far as his armies could march, stepped into the next chapter of conquest, one that would test Rome's courage against the edge of the known world. Roman preparations for the Second British Campaign grew into an operation unlike anything the legions had attempted before. What began as a simple plan to transport men across the Channel evolved into a vast logistical network intended to keep an entire army alive, supplied, and connected while fighting on an island that had never bowed to Rome. The vast courier vessels skimmed over the waves like ironclad messengers, designed solely for speed, carrying dispatches, scouts, and high-ranking officers between the shores of Gaul and the cliffs of Britain. Behind them came the great lumbering supply ships, their hulls filled with grain, weapons, spare equipment, tools, and everything an occupying force would need to survive in unfamiliar lands. As every crossing had to be timed with the tides, with the winds, and with the unpredictable moods of the Channel. A single misjudgment could ruin an entire convoy. Caesar built his force with equal precision. The legions chosen for the expedition were not merely experienced, they were battle-forged. These were men who had marched across the length of Gaul, endured storms in the north, fought chariots, cavalry, and hill warriors, and adapted to every strategy the tribes had thrown at them. They understood not only Roman discipline, but the necessity of improvisation in a land where the rules of warfare changed with every mile. The cavalry component was larger than before. Caesar knew that British mobility, especially their use of agile chariots, could only be countered by overwhelming mounted strength. Gallo-Roman riders joined Germanic auxiliaries, men who knew the speed of forest trails, the feel of uneven ground beneath their horses, and the rhythm of skirmishes fought far from open plains. These units practiced disembarking from ships at speed, forming tight lines on shifting sand and charging forward even as waves crashed at their heels. The engineers, Rome's quiet architects of conquest, trained just as rigorously. They practiced assembling prefabricated bridges that could span British rivers in hours. They learned how to transport siege engines across decks and unload them onto rough beaches. They studied British soil, British timber, British defensive patterns. These were the men who would carve roads into the island, fortify supply bases, and raise safe havens amid hostile ground. Diplomacy unfolded alongside military planning. Caesar's envoys moved through British tribal territories, quietly attempting to fracture their alliances. They sought leaders who felt overshadowed by the rising influence of Cassivellaunus, the chieftain who had united much of southeastern Britain during the first Roman incursion. Any rival, any jealous cousin, any neighboring tribe with a buried grievance could be shaped into an ally. The political landscape of Britain was a maze of blood ties, rivalries, and ancient feuds. Rome intended to walk through that maze and rearrange it in its own favor. Yet Cassivellaunus remained a formidable figure. Roman intelligence reported that he commanded not only warriors, but a network of alliances stretching through the thick forests and rolling hills that shielded Britain's heartlands. He was no mere tribal warlord. He was a strategist who understood Rome's reach and sought to blunt it with coordinated resistance. Timing became everything. The expedition could not depart too early when storms ruled the waters, nor too late when harvests ended and British food supplies dried up. Caesar aimed for a moment when winds were favorable, when the tides aligned, and when Britain itself was flush with the year's produce. He needed to arrive when the land could feed both its people and an occupying force. The day of departure cast a spectacle across the coastline of Gaul. A forest of masts rose from the harbors, transport ships, escort vessels, courier boats, and the new heavy transports built specifically for the British invasion. Their hulls were packed with legionaries, cavalry, engineers, physicians, administrators, blacksmiths, carpenters, interpreters. Everyone required to sustain Roman order on foreign soil. The fleet stretched across the water in ranks so long it seemed like a floating road of timber and iron leading west into the mist. This time, the crossing unfolded with practiced ease. The Romans now understood the tides. They respected the storms. They read the currents. And they corrected every mistake of the first expedition. When Britain's coastline appeared through the pale haze, the landing began with a precision that had been impossible 1 year earlier. But the British tribes had learned as well. Their defenders were ready. Fortifications lined the cliffs and beaches. Warriors waited behind embankments and earthworks. Chariots patrolled the higher ground, wheels kicking up sprays of dirt as their drivers prepared for the chaos to come. The sea boiled with the movement of Roman ships. The land bristled with British resistance. The clash was immediate. Roman soldiers stepped from their ships into cold water, shields raised as missiles arced overhead, but the new formations held. They pushed inland in waves, forming flexible lines that adjusted fluidly to the chariot assaults. The infantry moved as a breathing wall of iron, opening and closing ranks with practiced grace. The cavalry units swept around the flanks, meeting the British at the edges of their own mobility, turning what had once been the island's greatest advantage into a contested territory of speed and counterspeed. Then, as soon as the beachhead was secure, the engineers transformed the shoreline. Defensive ditches were carved into the earth. Timber palisades rose. Supply depots formed behind thick barricades. Every hour brought new fortifications, deeper trenches, stronger barriers. What had been an empty beach at dawn became a Roman stronghold by nightfall. Beyond the coast, British coalitions gathered, tribes woven together by urgent necessity. Throughout the previous year, their leaders had studied Roman tactics, and now they prepared ambushes, traps, and defensive positions designed to exploit local terrain. They aimed to pull Rome into the forest shadow, into narrow passes, into marshes where formations faltered and cavalry slowed. Negotiations followed battles, and battles followed negotiations. British tribal meetings weighed every option: resistance, surrender, tactical alliances, or temporary accommodation. Caesar's envoys pressed for tribute, for hostages, for political submission. The British urged unity, but unity was fragile. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface. Cassivellaunus became the voice of resistance, the figure who carried the weight of a nation's pride, trying to hold together a coalition that stretched from forest tribes to coastal clans. In the end, compromises took shape. Rome demanded tribute, grain, livestock, metals, and the promise of compliance. Hostages were offered as guarantees. Agreements were signed as uneasy alliances formed. The island had not fallen, but it had bowed. Britain was not conquered, but Rome now had a foothold deep enough to reshape its future. And on the horizon, Caesar saw what came next. A fragile peace held together by promises whispered across the channel, waiting for the moment when war would rise again. Even as Roman standards fluttered over British hills and Caesar secured tribute from wary island chieftains, the real danger to his achievements was quietly awakening far away. Back on the continent, he thought he had already broken. News traveled slowly over land and sea, carried by merchants, scouts, and frightened allies. At first, it came as fragments: a rumor of unrest here, a missing patrol there, a chieftain who no longer answered Roman summons. But soon the fragments began to align into a single, disturbing picture. Gaul was moving again. While Caesar crossed the channel, his legions scattered across winter quarters in Gaul. The forts were spread out to guard roads, monitor tribes, and collect grain. Individually, each garrison was strong. Together, they formed a net across the land. But nets can be torn if enough pressure is applied in enough places at once. In Caesar's absence, someone had been weaving that pressure. That someone was Avaricum of the Eburones, a man who not long before had been a relatively minor chieftain, ruling a small people among many. His lands lay not far from the Rhine, where forest, river, and frontier all met. It was a place where messages could cross secretly, where warriors could vanish into the trees, where Germanic allies were never far away. Avaricum had watched Rome. He had watched the building of roads, the spread of garrisons, the demands for grain and hostages. He saw the pattern, and he decided to break it. Through quiet envoys and late-night councils, he reached out to other tribal leaders, some resentful, some cautious, all weighing the future. One message repeated itself again and again: Rome was not invincible. It only needed to be struck in the right way at the right time. The most shocking proof came at Aduatuca. There, two Roman commanders, Sabinus and Cotta, commanded a legion and additional troops in what they believed was a stable region. Avaricum approached them with promises, warnings, and lies carefully arranged to exploit their fears. Whether through misjudgment, misplaced trust, or simple arrogance, they marched out under terms they thought would spare them disaster. Instead, they walked into it. In ravines and wooded slopes near their camp, Eburonian warriors waited. The Romans found themselves surrounded in broken ground where their perfect formations meant little. The result was catastrophic. An entire Roman force was cut down, their standards lost, their officers killed. Sabinus and Cotta never returned. The news of a duatuca flew through Gaul like sparks on dry grass. For the first time since Caesar's arrival, a Roman legion had been effectively destroyed, not by chance but by design. To the tribes of Gaul, it meant one thing: Rome could be hurt. By the time Caesar sailed back from Britain, the land he had left behind was not the same. His intelligence reports no longer spoke of isolated rebellions, but of something coordinated. Messages had crisscrossed through forests and valleys while he was gone. Plans had been made. Alliances had been forged. And at the center of this spreading resistance stood Avaricum, a man whose name now carried the weight of an idea. His strength did not lie in open battle. He understood that if he met Caesar's legions on a wide, clear field, discipline and iron would crush courage and speed. So he turned to the land itself. Eburonian territory was a tangle of dense woods, steep ravines, streams that cut through stone, and narrow tracks worn into the soil over generations. This was the Ardennes, a place where visibility vanished at every turn and sound echoed in strange ways through the trees. Here, Roman formations were not an advantage, they were a vulnerability. Avaricum broke with older Gallic habits of mass, glorious charges. Instead, he divided his warriors into small, fast-moving bands. They struck from behind tree lines, from slopes above roads, from bends in narrow paths where Roman columns had to compress, shields jammed close, lines disordered for a moment. A moment was all he needed. They hit supply trains, not main camps, isolated detachments, not entire legions, survey teams, road builders, and foraging parties. Arrows and javelins came from the trees, and then the forest swallowed the attackers before Roman counterattacks could form. It was a war of shadows, not shock. Behind these attacks, a larger structure was forming. Messages passed from village to village, hidden along riverbanks, sent across the Rhine to Germanic tribes who were more than willing to see Rome bleed. The Germanic warriors crossed over as allies, bringing fresh strength and the reassurance that the frontier itself was no longer secure. In response, Caesar understood something had changed. This was no longer a war of set-piece battles. It was a war of denial. If he could not drag Avaricum into a decisive engagement, he would attack the very possibility of resistance. So Rome turned its talent for siege and engineering against not a single fortress, but an entire landscape. The columns marched into Eburonian lands with orders not merely to punish, but to unmake. Granaries were burned. Fields of grain were cut down or trampled. Herds that could not be driven off were slaughtered. Villages were emptied, their houses pulled apart, their storehouses smashed. Sacred groves where generations had gathered to worship and decide the tribe's fate were cut and set alight. Fortified settlements, hilltop strongholds that had stood for centuries, were torn down stone by stone, their defenses filled in, their walls reduced to ruins. Smoke rose in thick pillars across the horizon. For anyone watching from the edges of the forest, it must have seemed as if the earth itself was being erased. This was not only military action, it was psychological warfare. Caesar wanted every man, woman, and child in Eburonian territory to see clearly what resistance would cost them. To understand that Rome could survive defeat, but smaller peoples might not survive Rome's anger. Avaricum, however, refused to be cornered by despair. If Rome was determined to destroy fixed positions, fields, villages, shrines, then he would rely on what Rome could not so easily crush: movement, memory, and knowledge of the land. His followers began to live lighter, carrying only what they needed, staying no longer than necessary in any camp. Their homes became the trees, the gullies, the rock-strewn hills. They adapted their lives to a rhythm of constant motion, striking, vanishing, watching, waiting. At the same time, their intelligence network grew sharper. Lookouts watched from hilltops and hidden platforms high in the trees. The small signals, smoke, reflections from polished metal, bird calls that didn't belong carried warnings across the woods. Scouts shadowed Roman columns from a distance, noting their direction, their pace, their supply lines. Ambiorix no longer sought to defeat a legion outright. He sought to bleed Rome slowly, one ambush, one burned wagon, one fallen centurion at a time. In the silent spaces between the trees, far from the stone forums of Rome and the ordered streets of its colonies, a different kind of war was being written. One in which empire and forest tested each other's patience, and no one yet knew which would endure the longest. Across the forests where smoke still drifted from ruined villages, Caesar pushed deeper into the Eburonian heartland. But even as Roman columns advanced with methodical precision, the proconsul's strategy widened beyond battlefields and burning fields. Steel alone would not break Ambiorix. Caesar aimed to suffocate him. To do that, he needed to take away not only the land beneath the rebels' feet, but the friends at their back. Wordless threats had already hung in the air. Any tribe who aided Ambiorix would face the same devastation now swallowing the Ardennes. Roman envoys slipped from camp to camp, carrying messages that were half warning, half promise. Cooperate and Rome would spare you. Resist and your forests would burn like the Eburones' forests burned. Many tribes listened, some out of fear, some out of calculation, some because they had envied Eburonian influence for years and saw now a chance to be free of it. But Caesar's most audacious diplomatic stroke lay across the Rhine. The Germanic warriors who had once answered Ambiorix's calls, they were now approached by Rome. It was a dangerous move. Roman generals did not cross the Rhine lightly. Yet Caesar knew that if the Germans could be turned, Ambiorix would be sealed inside a tightening cage with no escape. And so Roman envoys crossed the river with gifts, promises, and a single powerful offer. Join us in the destruction of your former allies, and the land you help us ruin will be yours to settle. The proposal struck deep. Germanic tribes coveted land, especially land emptied by war. Soon, warriors who had once marched beside Ambiorix returned wearing Roman armlets, guiding Roman scouts through the densest parts of the forest, revealing paths no Roman had ever taken. But for the Eburones, the betrayal was a wound deeper than any Roman sword. Their last allies had turned, their refuge beyond the Rhine had vanished. They were alone. What followed was a grim tightening of pressure. Roman scouts pushed deeper. The Germanic hunters moved like shadows between the trunks, picking up faint trails, whispering to Caesar's officers where Ambiorix's bands might be hiding. Every day, the safe places grew fewer. Inside Eburonian communities, cracks began to appear. Desertions increased. Families whispered that their homes were gone, their grain ash, their gods' groves cut down. For the first time, some questioned whether Ambiorix's promise of endurance could outweigh the reality of Roman destruction. Roman commanders took advantage of this. Amnesty was offered quietly, not loudly, so that those with trembling hearts might slip away without shame. Some fighters accepted. Each defection weakened Ambiorix's grip, frayed loyalty, and fed Roman intelligence. Ambiorix himself felt the shift. To hold his followers together, he resorted to harsher measures. Discipline grew severe. Suspected wavering was punished. Rousing speeches became strained, filled with defiance but shadowed by desperation. He told his warriors that Rome was stretched thin, that Caesar could not stay forever, that victory would come if they endured. But behind his words, the tightening noose was unmistakable. Where once the forest had been a shield, now it was becoming a trap. Roman engineering made certain of it. Fort after fort rose along the rivers and narrow passes, small, sharp teeth dug into the landscape, controlling crossings, guarding roadways, severing Ambiorix's ability to move unseen. The patrols radiated from each fort, overlapping into a net that grew stronger each week. Rome was learning the forest. Legionaries were trained to operate in small, agile groups. They practiced navigating thickets without losing cohesion. They carried lighter packs, shorter lines, learned to move silently, learned to fight in tight spaces where shields scraped bark and branches snapped beneath boots. Auxiliary scouts, Gauls and Germans guided them deeper, teaching them the sound of a hidden archer, the shape of a false trail, the silence before an ambush. The imperial machine was adapting, and adaptation made it terrifying. Ambiorix survived through motion and disappearance. But each month his world shrank a little more. Roman devastation left nothing behind, no crops to harvest, no villages to shelter in, no stores to retrieve. The Germanic allies hunted the same paths he used. Roman forts blocked escape eastward or southward. Food became scarce. Hunger crept in alongside fear. Yet even as Caesar pressed harder, a different kind of movement was beginning elsewhere in Gaul, quiet, spreading, and unlike anything that had come before. In the winter lodges of central Gaul, in the smoke-filled halls of aristocrats and the wide clearings where druids spoke beneath bare branches, murmurs turned toward a new idea, a single resistance, unified, coordinated, bound not by tribe but by purpose. And at the center of those murmurs stood a young nobleman of the Arverni, Vercingetorix, son of Celtulus, descended from kings, tempered by observation, sharpened by Rome's own teachings. While Ambiorix fought from the forest, Vercingetorix studied from the shadows. He had watched Caesar win because Gaul fought tribe by tribe. He had watched uprisings spark bright and die alone. He had watched Rome break every fragmented resistance and knew the pattern had to change. Where others saw defeat, he saw lessons. Where others saw ruin, he saw opportunity. He understood Roman discipline, Roman supply chains, Roman politics, Roman vulnerabilities. He understood, too, the Celtic heart, proud, fierce, deeply loyal to tribe, but yearning for a leader who could rise above tribal boundaries. He saw that if Gaul were to survive, it needed something Gaul had never had before: one war, one voice, one command. The memory of the Helvetii, Ariovistus, the Belgae, the Veneti, and now the Eburones, their defeats had shown the weakness of fighting alone. And Vercingetorix offered something different: a new doctrine, a new strategy, a new fire in the ashes of old rebellions. He called for scorched earth, not as Caesar used it, but as Gaul would wield it. He called for the burning of fields before Rome could claim them. He called for denying Caesar everything: food, shelter, forage, resources. He called for coordinated strikes on Roman supply lines, for surrounding isolated garrisons, for turning Caesar's strengths into weaknesses. It was a plan that asked enormously of every tribe: sacrifice now or lose everything forever, hardship for a season or servitude for generations. And as winter deepened across Gaul, this plan, this vision, began to spread like a spark catching on dry leaves. Something new was awakening. something Rome had not yet seen. Something that would force Caesar into the most desperate campaign of his life. And all of it moved beneath the emerging shadow of one name, Vercingetorix. While Amberix melted into the forests and Germanic settlers moved into the lands Rome had emptied, a different kind of resistance was gathering somewhere far to the south, less a spark in the undergrowth and more a storm forming over the whole of Gaul. It had a face, it had a name, and unlike the others, it dreamed not of saving one tribe but of awakening an entire people. Vercingetorix moved carefully at first. He spoke in shadowed halls and firelit gatherings, in the high chambers of Arvernian nobles and the crowded meeting places of other tribes. He did not come as a desperate rebel, but as a strategist, calm, composed, and carrying the weight of a past soaked in Roman intrusion. The fathers killed, kingships denied, sacred lands administered like provinces. He knew what Gaul had become under Caesar, divided, watched, taxed, catalogued. He also knew what Gaul once had been in story and memory. Free, quarrelsome, but its own. To build something greater than any previous uprising, he needed more than anger. He needed agreement. So his arguments moved on several levels at once. And to proud warriors, he spoke of honor, of the humiliation of serving as auxiliaries in foreign wars, of cities where Roman laws had silenced old customs. To chiefs, he spoke of power, of how client kingship under Rome was a gilded cage, never truly secure, always dependent on Caesar's favor. And to druids, he spoke of the gods of groves leveled, rites disrupted, and sacred cycles bent to foreign calendars. Above all, he spoke of something Gaul had never known, unity. Bit by bit, the circle widened. From the mists of the Atlantic coast, where traders had long watched Roman ships approach, to the rivers that flowed toward the Rhine, where tribes had learned the sharp edge of frontier politics, messengers began to ride in Vercingetorix's name. Old rivalries were not forgotten but set aside. Oaths were sworn that did not end at tribal borders but stretched from forest to plain, hill to sea. For the first time, Gaul was trying to breathe with one set of lungs. But unity alone would not be enough. The wars of the past had shown that courage, no matter how fierce, broke against Roman discipline like waves against stone. Vercingetorix understood this. He did not want another glorious defeat. So he did something few Gallic leaders had ever truly done. He reorganized how Gaul went to war. Under his direction, warriors from different tribes did not simply join in a great shouting mass. They trained together. They learned to move as one. Messengers carried not just calls to arms but instructions. How to hold formation, how to respond to signals, how to coordinate attacks across hills, forests, and rivers. A command was no longer just the loudest voice on the field. It was a structure stretching across distances, able to direct whole regions of Gaul like limbs of the same body. Supply lines, too, were reconsidered. If Gaul's warriors were to fight far from home and stay in the field for long seasons, they needed something Rome had always excelled at: organization. Grain had to be gathered, stored, moved. Herds had to be driven safely. Blacksmiths and craftsmen had to work not for a single tribe's war party, but for an army that belonged to all of Gaul. Old hilltop strongholds, the oppida, suddenly acquired new meaning. They had always stood above valleys and rivers, watchful and stubborn, but now they were woven into a defensive network. Each one served as a storehouse, a rallying point, a signal fire in waiting. If Rome came, the oppida could slow them, bleed them, or force them into long, exhausting sieges that drained soldiers, supplies, and time. Vercingetorix was not trying to win one battle. He was trying to stretch Rome until it tore. Caesar's first warnings did not come from Romans at all, but from Gauls who had chosen loyalty to him, nobles who still benefited from Roman alliance, who had grain contracts to protect and families bound by hostages in Roman care. Their messages were uneasy, edged with fear. Something is different, they said. This is not like before. They did not bring tales of one tribe rising, but of many. Not of one city in revolt, but of plans that seemed to echo across the whole of central Gaul. Caesar listened, and for the first time in years what he heard sounded like a genuine threat, not to a region but to his entire Gallic achievement. Then came Cenabum. It was not an accidental riot nor a sudden flash of anger. It was an act of cold design. On a day chosen with care, the Gallic inhabitants turned on the Romans within, merchants, administrators, settlers who believed themselves secure in a city whose wealth flowed through trade sanctioned by Rome. They were cut down systematically, their goods seized, their presence erased. The city burned, and with it the illusion that Rome was untouchable in the heart of Gaul. The message was clear and brutal: neutrality is over. You are either for Rome or you are for Gaul. There is no safe middle ground. Attacks followed like echoes. Across central and western Gaul, Roman garrisons suddenly found themselves under assault from warriors who seemed to know exactly how their camps were laid out, where their supplies were stored, which roads they relied on most. The communication posts fell, convoys disappeared, minor forts were stormed or starved. For the first time, Caesar's network of control shuddered, not at one point but at many. Casualties were heavy. Surprised, cut off, or overwhelmed, some Roman positions simply vanished from the map. For Gauls who had lived under Roman shadow for years, this was electrifying. They saw that the legions could bleed, that the eternal Roman presence could retreat, that Caesar, for all his triumphs, was not a god. Vercingetorix's name now traveled faster than any official decree. Caesar reacted the only way he could, by pulling scattered forces together. His previous strategy, thin threads of garrisons stretched across the land, had made sense when Gaul was largely subdued. Now those threads were being cut. He needed fists, not fingers. He recalled legions from exposed positions, knowing that each withdrawal was a signal to the watching tribes. Here, Rome has let go. It was a risk. Wherever his legions moved, new gaps opened. Wherever they gathered, other areas remained vulnerable. Vercingetorix understood this, and he tested those gaps constantly. The first great collision of their strategies came at Avaricum, the betrayal's proud oppidum, rising above marshes and river like a stone crown on the landscape. Its position was strong by nature and stronger still by generations of fortification. To many Gauls, Avaricum was not just a city, it was a symbol. Vercingetorix advised that it be abandoned and burned rather than let it become a trap. Better to deny Caesar its shelter, its supplies, its hope. But the betrayals pleaded for its preservation, unable to bear the thought of destroying their finest city with their own hands. In a rare concession to emotion, he agreed. So Avaricum remained standing, and Caesar came for it. Roman engineers encircled the city like a tightening ring. Lines of earthworks and wooden walls circumvallation rose from the mud and reed-fringed ground, designed not only to keep the defenders in, but to keep relief forces out. Every ditch dug, every stake planted, every ramp raised was a message: we are not leaving. But this siege was not one-sided. From within the walls, Gallic defenders watched every move. Their engineers had studied Roman methods. They had thickened the walls in vulnerable spots, reinforced gates, prepared secondary defenses inside. When Roman workers came too close, sorties stormed out, screaming and hurling missiles, trying to disrupt construction and shatter Roman morale. Outside, beyond the Roman lines, Vercingetorix hovered with his cavalry and warriors, probing, threatening, testing. He could not allow himself to be drawn into a pitched battle under unfavorable conditions, but he could pressure the siege, harass foraging parties, try to starve the besiegers as they sought to starve the besieged. Caught between the hammer of Rome and the anvil of Gallic resistance, Avaricum became a crucible. Day after day, Romans worked under constant danger, one eye on their tools, one eye on the horizon. Rain turned their trenches to mud. The cold bit hands already blistered from labor. Any horn call from the walls or dust cloud on the horizon might signal a sudden assault, and so they learned to drop shovel and seize shield in a heartbeat. Inside the city, defenders endured their own test. Stocks dwindled. The knowledge that no easy relief would break the siege gnawed at them. Yet the walls still stood, and with them stood hope. Behind stone and timber, behind ditches and sharpened stakes, they believed they might hold long enough for Vercingetorix to find his moment. When the final breaches came, they did not collapse quickly. The fighting that followed was not a simple rush, but a brutal house-to-house struggle, streets running red, flames licking at rooftops, allies and family members shouting above the clash of shields and the groan of collapsing structures. In that savage, closing heat of battle at Avaricum, both Rome and Gaul glimpsed what their conflict had become. No longer a series of isolated campaigns, but a war for the very shape of the land's future. With each city, each hill, each forest crossroads a question asked in blood. And neither Caesar nor Vercingetorix had yet reached the end of what they were willing to do to win. The fires of Avaricum were still burning when the legions marched on, their armor smeared with ash and the memory of what they had done. The city's screams carried farther than its smoke. As they traveled by rumor, by messengers, by terrified refugees who escaped only because Romans did not bother to chase them. Every tribe in Gaul heard what had happened, not whispered, not softened. Avaricum had died to make a point. And Vercingetorix heard it too. He knew now with brutal clarity that Caesar had no interest in half measures. If a city refused Rome, it would be erased. If a tribe defied Rome, it would be starved. The message echoed across forests, over rivers, through the halls of chiefs who had once hesitated. Join the resistance, and your people might share Avaricum's fate. But instead of frightening Gaul into submission, the massacre hardened it. While Roman engineers pulled down the last scaffolds of their siege towers and administrators moved through the smoldering ruins, counting what could still be stolen, fresh reports rode into Caesar's camp, urgent, troubling, unmistakable. Something vast was gathering at Gergovia. Not a raid, not an uprising, a host. The heart of Arverni power, perched atop its volcanic crown, had become the beating center of a resistance unlike anything Gaul had ever attempted. If Avaricum was Caesar's message to Gaul, then Gergovia was Vercingetorix's message to Caesar. Come if you dare. Few fortresses in the known world looked like Gergovia. It did not simply sit on high ground, it towered over everything around it. A sprawling plateau rose from the valley like the lifted shield of a giant, its sides steep, scarred, and narrow enough that even a handful of defenders could turn entire legions back. The paths spiraling toward the summit bent and twisted in ways that forced attackers to bunch, climb, gasp for breath, then expose themselves to warriors who knew every stone, every crevice, every point where the mountain's skin grew thin. From above, Gallic lookouts could see days away. They watched dust rise on distant roads and knew exactly when and where Caesar's army moved. They prepared their positions with a calm that came only from confidence in the land beneath their feet. The plateau held its own water, its granaries were full, its fortifications were carved by generations. This was no panicked last stand. This was a fortress built to endure. Long before Caesar's scouts ever glimpsed the walls, Vercingetorix had turned the slopes below into a layered defense. Hidden pitfalls lined with sharpened stakes, false paths that led attackers straight into kill zones, concealed platforms from which javelins and stones could rain in deadly arcs. And for the first time, the defenders were not one tribe alone. Warriors from Nervii forests, from the hills of the Senons, from the plains of the Betrayal, from the valleys of the Arverni themselves, stood shoulder to shoulder. They brought different weapons, different local tactics, but under Vercingetorix's command they formed a single shield wall, its edges jagged, its center iron. Caesar had crushed Gauls before, but he had never faced Gaul as one people. The march toward Gergovia in the spring of 52 BC was unlike any other in Caesar's campaigns. The legions moved with full siege equipment, thousands of pack animals, carpenters, engineers, and scouts who knew that the task ahead was not a simple reduction. It was an attempt to climb a mountain defended by men who had no intention of letting it go. Even before they reached the foot of the plateau, the land tested them. Gallic skirmishers shadowed the Roman columns like ghosts, appearing just long enough to kill a straggler, cut a rope, stampede a pack mule, then vanish into the woods before any counterattack could form. They struck at dusk and dawn, each time from a new angle. They fought to slow the legions, not destroy them, because delay itself was a weapon. Vercingetorix was forcing Caesar into a siege where the land itself fought for the defenders. When the Romans finally arrived, the proconsul inspected Gergovia from below. What he saw troubled even him. The walls followed the plateau's shape so perfectly that they looked grown from the rock rather than built upon it. The defensive towers rose at intervals that allowed crossing fire, and narrow gate passages opened into interior courtyards designed to trap and slaughter any who breached the first line. Roman artillery, so devastating on open plains, could barely be positioned on the jagged slopes. Siege towers, normally rolled forward by teams of men, would have to be pulled uphill, under constant fire, on terrain where the wheels would sink or break. And even if the Romans reached the walls, scaling ladders would become unstable on the slant, while Gallic defenders, high above, could simply push them away. Gergovia was not merely defensible. It was a nightmare, but Caesar could not walk away. Not after Avaricum, not with all Gaul watching. So he began the impossible task. Roman engineers attempted to carve new roads into the mountainside, building terraced platforms for siege works. The stone resisted them, breaking tools and fingers alike. Harassment attacks grew constant, arrows from the mist, sling stones from unexpected angles, war cries erupting from hidden positions. The Romans pressed on. As days stretched into weeks, Caesar made his next move, a dawn assault through low, thick fog. Under the muffled light, legionaries advanced up the twisting paths, shields lifted, breath tight in their chests, climbing into a world of shadow and echo. As they reached the first Gallic line, they seized it, For a moment it seemed possible until the fog lifted, and the plateau's full width, lined with thousands of Gallic warriors, roared awake. The counterattack crashed down like a wave of iron and oak. Stones rained, spears arced, warriors surged from hidden trenches with terrifying coordination. Messages flew by horn and torch across the plateau as if the entire mountaintop breathed as one creature. The Romans saw at last what Avaricum's fall had not revealed. Vercingetorix was not simply resisting. He was fighting to teach Rome fear, and on the slopes of Gergovia he succeeded. The slopes of Gergovia did more than bleed the legions. They tore a hole in the idea that Rome always won. When the trumpets finally called the retreat, it was not a feigned withdrawal or a tactical lure. It was a real pulling back, step by step, shield by shield, from a mountain that refused to be taken. Men who had fought in Spain in the east and across half of Gaul looked back over their shoulders and saw something they had never truly seen before. A Gallic army, still standing, still shouting, still defiant on ground of its own choosing. The dead were left where they fell on the slopes, too many, too high, too dangerous to recover. Veterans who had marched with Caesar from his earliest campaigns lay among them, their training, scars, and hard-won experience vanishing into the rock and dust of Gergovia's flanks. But for the legions, the loss was not just counted in bodies. It was counted in belief. Whispers moved through the camps at night, not mutiny, not yet, but questions. Had Caesar misjudged the ground? Had the gods grown tired of Roman victories? If they could not take Gergovia, what else might they fail to take? Caesar understood the danger of those questions as clearly as he understood the tactical realities. To insist on another assault in that same terrain would not be courage, it would be suicide. Gergovia had been chosen by Vercingetorix like a knife chosen for the shape of its edge. It was meant to cut Roman strength precisely where it was sharpest. So Caesar did something that went against the grain of Roman pride. He let go. The order came for a controlled withdrawal, not a desperate flight. The standards were carried away intact, baggage secured, lines kept tight. The legions did not run, they turned, they marched, they watched their rear ranks with a new, sharper wariness. They were not used to leaving an enemy fortress unconquered behind them. But Rome leaving a battle without a victory echoed through Gaul like thunder. Far away, in forests where messengers rested beside smoky fires, the news spread. Gergovia still stands. Vercingetorix has held. Caesar has bled and left. Tribes that had stayed carefully neutral now lined toward the flame. Chiefs who had once spoken cautiously of accommodation began to speak openly of opportunity. Warriors who had fought as auxiliaries alongside Rome found themselves wondering whether they had chosen the wrong side of history. Gergovia was not just a battlefield. It was a signal. Vercingetorix saw that more clearly than anyone. He knew that simply sitting atop his impregnable plateau would not win the war. A defensive victory was powerful, but only if he turned its momentum outward, striking while the Roman armies were still nursing their wounds and their confidence was cracked. So he took a gamble. He began to gather more than an army. He began to gather all of Gaul. From the Atlantic coasts, from the deep woods near the Rhine, from the plains of the north and the river valleys of the center, contingents marched. Some arrived as small, hardened war bands, heads held high beneath strange standards. Others came as long columns, with wagons and families and animals in tow, ready to stake everything on one last throw against Roman rule. All of them moved toward a single hill in Burgundy, Alesia on Mont Auxois. Alesia did not look as dramatic as Gergovia at first glance, but it sat on its own island of stone, a hill rising above the plains, ringed with slopes steep enough to slow any attacker, yet close enough to fertile lands and roadways that a massive host could be fed, supplied, and reinforced. From there, Vercingetorix could watch the open country, send riders in every direction, and draw to himself the strength of a continent on the edge of revolt. For Caesar, this was both a threat and an opportunity. If he ignored Alesia, Vercingetorix's coalition would only grow. Roman garrisons scattered across Gaul would become isolated islands in a rising sea, attacked in detail, one after another. But if he marched against the hill and failed a second time, his entire Gallic adventure could unravel. He chose to march. When the legions reached Alesia and saw what Vercingetorix had done, it must have felt like stepping into a test designed just for them. The hilltop town bristled with defenses. The slopes were scarred with ditches, walls, and wooden palisades. Behind them stood not one tribe but many faces from every corner of Gaul, banners from 100 peoples, all brought under one command. Vercingetorix had placed himself inside the fortress not because he wished to cower behind its walls, but because he was playing a different game. He knew that once Caesar committed to a siege, Rome itself would be tied to that hill. Gaul would have time to gather, to form a vast relief army and strike from the outside while the garrison struck from within. He intended to turn Caesar's greatest strength, his willingness to stand and hold a line, into a trap. Caesar understood the danger, and he chose to meet it with something Gaul had never seen before. He would not storm Alesia, he would encircle it, twice. He ordered his engineers to begin an immense ring of fortifications, an inner line facing the hill to seal Vercingetorix and his warriors inside, and an outer line facing the plains to hold off whatever colossal force Gaul might yet send. The result, slowly taking shape as timber, earth, and stone rose across miles of countryside, was a cage built around a cage. The inner line hugged the base of Mont Auxois, following every rise and dip with stubborn precision. Ditches were dug, stakes planted, towers raised, artillery emplacements positioned to sweep each approach with deadly fire. Communication trenches and signal posts knit the whole ring together so that if one point came under attack, nearby cohorts could be rushed to its support. Beyond that, further out, the outer line began to grow, a second, broader belt of earthworks and palisades stretching over fields, across streams, and along wooded ridges. The distances were staggering. Roughly 10 miles around the hill and about 13 around the surrounding plain. No other commander in Roman history had tried something quite like this. It was a siege not just of a city, but of a nation's last hope. Every day, the work continued under danger. From the heights, Gallic archers and slingers watched for exposed clusters of laborers, raining missiles down when they saw an opening. From nearby woods, small Gallic parties darted into ambush work details, trying to burn half-built structures, kill surveyors, disrupt the measuring lines that guided construction. Despite this, the lines slowly closed. Roman engineers filled the gaps with more than walls. They added hidden pits lined with stakes, interlocking trenches, and rows of sharpened branches designed to tear apart any charge before it reached the main defenses. Kill zones were laid out with clinical precision, so that if attackers found a gap and poured toward it, they would find themselves funneled into spaces where Roman missiles and blades could reap them by the hundreds. Inside Alesia, the Watchers saw all of this and knew time was no longer their ally. The ring around them had teeth, So Vercingetorix acted. The first phase of the Alesian struggle began with the garrison itself. Under cover of darkness and mist, Gallic warriors surged down from the hill, aiming at weak points in the unfinished inner line. Their goal was not just to break out, but to shatter the siege from within, to tear holes in the newborn fortifications before the outer line was complete. Roman cohorts rushed to meet them in the half-light. Torches swung, horns called, shouts merged into a rolling roar. It was fighting at close quarters along narrow works, men slipping in mud, grappling over sharpened stakes, falling backward into ditches already slick with blood. Even as these attacks crashed into the inner ring, raiding parties pushed further, trying to harass the workers laboring on the outer defenses. For a time, it seemed possible that the massive undertaking would be shattered before it fully took shape. But the lines held, bruised, blood-stained, and incomplete, yes, but still there. Then one day dust appeared on the horizon, not a column, not a detachment. A wall of movement stretching across the open land as far as the eye could see. The relief army had come. They poured in from every direction, tribes that had never before marched together in such numbers now gathering under an array of chieftains and war leaders. By some reports, more than 250,000 warriors, backed by cavalry, chariots, and elite retinues, now formed an outer ring of flesh and iron around Caesar's ring of wood and earth. Inside the fortifications, the legions and their allies stood. Inside that on the hill, Vercingetorix and the garrison waited. Rome, Gaul, and the future of the province were now locked into a single, tightening knot. The second phase of the battle began as the relief army tested the outer line, probing for weaknesses, launching assaults against towers and gates, trying to overwhelm isolated positions by sheer weight of numbers. The Romans shifted and countershifted, rushing cohorts from quiet sectors to collapsing ones, using their walls as force multipliers to hold back what would have crushed them in the open. There was no front now. Every side was the front. And then came the third phase, the moment Vercingetorix had been working toward from the beginning. Signals flashed, horns cried, fires flared in patterns agreed upon long before. From the hill, the garrison surged outward in a coordinated assault against the inner ring. From the plains, the relief army launched its heaviest attacks yet against the outer line. And woven between them, smaller specialized Gallic forces moved to infiltrate the spaces between Roman sectors. Hidden ravines, partially finished works, blind spots in the Roman field of view. Their goal was to strike where the fortifications bent but did not quite meet, to snap the Roman lines at their weakest joinings. For a brief, terrifying span of time, Caesar's army stood between two roaring storms, each one timed to crash against him at once. On the slopes above, in the trenches below, and along the walls in between, the final question of Gaul would be decided. Not in quiet policy, not in distant Senate debate, but in the shrieking, grinding, close-locked struggle around Alesia. And as the night and day of that climactic assault unfolded, both Rome and Gaul would find out how far they were truly willing to go to shape the fate of the land between the Rhine and the sea. The moment the coordinated Gallic assault crashed against both rings of Roman fortifications, the fate of an entire nation hung in the balance. For a heartbeat, long enough for a horn to sound, long enough for dust to rise under 1,000 running feet, it seemed possible that the walls would break, that the legions would fold inward and collapse, and that Gaul would erupt out of its siege cage like a storm breaking through a dam. If the Gallic timing had been perfect, If their signals had aligned just a little more cleanly, Rome might have been swallowed whole on that plain. Instead, something else happened. Caesar himself appeared on the line. Not in the rear, not in the center giving calm orders, but at the farthest, most desperate point, where the outer defenses buckled under the pressure of the massive relief army. He did not wait for reports. He did not wait for officers. He rode into the chaos like a man who understood that leadership in that moment had to be seen, not merely exercised. And the legions saw him. The white horse, the red cloak, the unmistakable profile, cutting through smoke and javelins like a moving standard. He gathered the cavalry around him, pointed toward the swelling mass of Gallic warriors pushing toward the weakest Roman gate, and led the charge himself. Steel crashed, horses screamed. The Roman wedge punched through the Gallic line so sharply that it broke the rhythm of the entire attack. Messages faltered. Signals misfired. The long pulse of the coordinated offensive shuddered and lost its alignment. For the Gallic warriors, it must have been like watching a bowstring snap in the middle of a drawn shot. For the Romans, it was the breath they needed. Across the siege lines, the defenders held, sometimes by a single man, sometimes by sheer exhausted stubbornness, but they held. They saw their commander in the dust and blood, and they understood what it meant. If Caesar was still fighting, there was no excuse for any Roman to fall back. And so the tide turned. As the sun dropped low and the lines took on the dim, flickering gold of late evening, the Gallic offensive began to fracture. First in small places, then in visible, widening cracks. The pressure fell unevenly. Some tribal groups pulled back too soon. Others hesitated too long, and the unity that had made their assault so terrifying dissolved into a dozen uncoordinated struggles. By nightfall, the great coordinated attack, the one that might have broken Rome's spine, had failed. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the torches flickering across the plain, listened to the change in the battle's sound, and understood what it meant. The chance had passed. His people had thrown everything at the Roman lines, and Rome had not broken. He could continue the fight and watch his warriors die 1 month at a time, one ration at a time, or he could give the tribes something else. The future, however small, however uncertain. So the next morning he put on his finest armor, his cloak, his torque of rank, and mounted his horse. The gates opened. The Roman lines watched in silence as the most powerful man Gaul had produced in generations rode down the slope alone. He did not kneel. He did not beg. He surrendered as a king, offering himself so that his people would not bleed further. In that moment, the war ended. But peace did not begin. Caesar's victory at Alesia reshaped the entire continent. Gaul was now Rome's, utterly, irreversibly. From the cold plateaus of Armorica to the forests near the Rhine, from the river valleys of the Sequani to the fertile lands of the Bicheriges, all fell into the orbit of Roman administration. Yet in the shadows of the great defeat, pockets of defiance clung to the ruins of their freedom. The Bellovaci vanished into their forests, fighting as ghosts among ancient trees. Their raids struck Roman supply lines like knife cuts in the dark. Their strongholds, hidden in ravines beneath thick canopies, deep in woods older than memory, became centers of stubborn resistance. Caesar answered not with tolerance but with fire. Forests that had sheltered generations were cut down and burned. Entire villages suspected of helping the rebels were erased, buildings flattened, people sold into slavery, fields given to tribes who had stayed loyal. It was harsh, it was deliberate, and it sent a message as cold as iron. Rome would not allow Gaul to rise again. Farther south, the Carnutes, the spiritual heart of Gaul, met an even more ruthless fate. Their sacred groves, where druids had gathered each year in ceremony and law, were torn down, altars destroyed, priests executed. The rituals that had carried Gallic identity through centuries were crushed under the weight of Roman political necessity. No more councils, no more pan-Gallic festivals, no more druidic authority binding tribes together. Rome understood something profound. To secure Gaul, they had to break the places where Gaul remembered itself. And then came the garrisons. The fortified camps rose across the landscape like new stars. Orderly, geometric, disciplined, each one placed where rivers crossed, where mountain paths joined, where roads ran together. Legionaries guarded them, but auxiliaries, often drawn from tribes who had chosen Rome early, served within them as well, turning former enemies into guardians of the new order. Inside these camps were the seeds of Roman civilization. Granaries, workshops, temples, armories, and offices where clerks wrote Latin onto wax tablets. Around them markets grew, then neighborhoods, then towns. Gaul was being rebuilt one stone at a time. Roman law seeped into every corner, governing trade, property, justice. Young nobles began learning Latin. Some were sent to Rome itself, where they studied rhetoric, philosophy, and politics, preparing to return as administrators, interpreters, and future senators of a world their grandfathers had tried to destroy. Roads spread outward in every direction, straight, durable, engineered with a precision no other culture had matched. Along them traveled soldiers, merchants, ideas, and taxes, way stations, waypoints, posting houses, couriers carrying imperial messages. Tribal identity began to soften. Gallic warriors traded tribal tattoos for auxiliary uniforms. Chieftains became magistrates. Oppida became Roman towns. A Celtic religion retreated into the shadows. Gaul was no longer a frontier, it was becoming Roman. And the transformation, once begun, moved with a momentum no surviving tribe could halt. In the years that followed the last great battles, Rome did not simply conquer Gaul with legions. It absorbed it carefully, deliberately, and with an almost clinical understanding of how power survives. The first challenge was the warriors themselves. Generations of Gauls had been raised to see courage in battle as the highest virtue. Men still told stories of Helvetian charges, of Belgic fury, of the burning of homelands and the stand at Alesia. If those instincts were left intact and separate, they could easily harden into new centers of revolt. So Rome did something subtle. Rather than banning Gallic martial traditions, it redirected them. Young warriors who might once have followed a tribal chieftain into the forest now marched under Roman standards as auxiliary soldiers. They learned new formations, Roman commands, Latin drill words, but they brought with them their ferocity, their local knowledge, their skill in rough terrain. The commanders were careful, though. Purely Gallic units concentrated in one place under one of their own were dangerous. The legions understood this, so auxiliaries were mixed, reassigned, blended into a wider machine. The energy of the warrior class was not crushed, it was harnessed and repurposed. While this was happening on the frontier roads and in garrisons, another transformation unfolded in the fields and valleys of Gaul. Rome measured everything. Surveyors with measuring rods and wax tablets fanned out across the conquered lands. They recorded how much grain a valley could yield, how many herds grazed a plateau, what metals lay beneath a hillside, how many people lived in each district, and what they could be made to pay. Behind them, administrators turned these numbers into obligations. Fields that had once fed only a tribe now also fed legions. Herds that had once symbolized wealth within a clan now walked along Roman roads as tribute. Olive oil, wine, and Roman tools appeared in villages that had never seen such things before, and with them came dependence on Roman supply chains. Productivity rose. So did extraction. Roman plows, iron tools, and disciplined planting schedules increased yields, but the surplus flowed steadily south and east, toward cities whose names most Gauls had only heard in stories. Massilia, Narbo, Rome. The ships carried Gallic grain and livestock to Mediterranean markets, where produce from Gaul became a familiar and profitable commodity. Yet beneath this economic efficiency lay a darker current. The conquest had torn entire communities from the land. Men, women, and children were marched in chains towards slave markets that turned human suffering into calculable profit. Caesar himself boasted of selling vast numbers of captives. Later estimates suggest that over 1 million Gauls were enslaved during those 8 relentless years. They became laborers on Italian estates, miners in Spanish hills, quarry workers, craftsmen in workshops, and household servants in Rome's expanding neighborhoods. Their skills, metalwork, farming, woodworking, made them valuable, but their presence was also a warning. This is what happens when you stand against Rome and lose. Tribute systems made the new order permanent. Each tribal district, now a line on a Roman map, received its own schedule of payments. Grain by the season, cattle by the count, silver by the weight, sometimes manufactured goods or textiles where local crafts were strong. These obligations were recorded, stored, checked, and enforced. To make such a system function, Rome had to reach into every corner of Gallic life. Clerks tracked figures. Couriers moved reports along the new roads. Soldiers accompanied collectors when necessary. The bureaucracy spread quietly, stitching towns and villages into an invisible web of obligations that all led in the end to the same place: Roman authority. And as tribute and taxes flowed outward, merchants flowed inward. Roman traders set up permanent shops in newly pacified towns. Amphorae of wine and oil stood in warehouses near Gallic grain and smoked meats. Fine pottery, glassware, metal household goods, textiles, and jewelry appeared in marketplaces where once only local craftwork had been sold. Trade did more than enrich Rome, it changed aspiration. A chieftain who had once measured his status in cattle and war stories now might measure it in imported wine, Roman tableware, and the ability to dress his household in fabrics indistinguishable from those worn in Italy. Its economic dependence softened grudges. It is harder to burn the world down when the world now runs through your own doorstep. Beneath the soil, another kind of wealth was being drawn out. Gold, silver, iron, and other minerals that had been worked on a small scale by Celtic smiths were now extracted under Roman direction. Deeper shafts, stronger tools, more organized labor, often slave labor, turned the hills of Gaul into engines of metal production. The profits from these operations went largely to Roman investors and their allies, but local elites were rarely excluded entirely. Agreements were drawn up, shares were allotted. The message was clear. Those who cooperated could prosper, those who resisted could vanish. The consequences of all this did not stop at the edge of Gallic territory. Caesar returned from his campaigns a transformed man. He was no longer merely a successful general. He was the master of vast new resources. Gold and silver from Gaul funded his games, his public works, his bribes, and his propaganda. The legions who had followed him through mud, snow, and blood were now veterans fiercely loyal to him personally. With that wealth and that army, he could challenge the old order in Rome itself. And he did. The civil wars that followed the crossing of the Rubicon, the battles that shattered Pompey's faction, the gradual dismantling of republican checks, all rested on the foundation that Gaul had provided. Without those campaigns, without that treasure and those veterans, Caesar would have remained one ambitious politician among many. With them, he became something else entirely. From those years of conquest, an empire was born. Rome had extended itself decisively into temperate Europe. It proved, to itself and to others, that Mediterranean institutions could function far from the olive groves and marble forums of Italy. The administrative frameworks tested in Gaul, roads, census systems, tribute, mixed garrisons, cooperative elites, became templates for later expansion into other provinces. But Gaul did not simply vanish into Roman uniformity. Instead, something more complicated emerged, a fusion. Gallic art, spirals, knotwork, flowing curves began to appear alongside Roman columns and mosaics. Local gods were paired with Roman ones, reinterpreted, folded into a broader pantheon rather than erased outright. Shrines changed, but some festivals, some rites, survived under new names and with new justifications. Languages overlapped. Latin spread through law, trade, and administration. Celtic tongues persisted in homes, marketplaces, and songs. Elites often became fluent in both, moving with ease between a Roman courtroom and a Gallic household gathering. Is in their minds and in their speech two worlds intertwined. Schools in Romanized towns produced a new class of people, bilingual, bicultural, and politically useful. They could quote Roman law in one breath and invoke local custom in the next. When the power of Rome at the center began to flicker centuries later, it would be these men, or their descendants, who would keep some semblance of order alive in the provinces. They knew how to govern a town, how to keep roads open, how to maintain tax rolls, how to negotiate with neighboring groups. They were the bridge between empire and what came after. The frontier that mattered most lay to the northeast. There the Rhine hardened from a river into an idea, the limit of Rome's direct rule. On one bank, Roman roads, Roman towns, Roman law. On the other, Germanic forests, shifting alliances, and peoples who watched Rome carefully, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, always adapting. To protect that line, Rome devastated swathes of land between its own settlements and the free Germanic zones. These buffer regions were not empty, but they were deliberately thinned, disrupted, and reshaped to make invasions more difficult and surveillance easier. That line, drawn in strategy and blood, would echo through European history. For centuries, the distinction between this side of the Rhine and that side would shape political boundaries, cultural identities, and eventually languages. Within Gaul, the new culture deepened. Roman building techniques raised stone towns where once timber fortresses had stood. Forums replaced tribal gathering fields as the places where disputes were settled and business agreed upon. Basilicas hosted legal cases. Temples rose to imported gods, but often with decorations that still whispered of an older Celtic imagination. Celtic patterns traced themselves into Roman floors and jewelry. Old symbols were carved into new stone. The religion shifted again with the coming of Christianity, blending classical traditions with local practices. But the underlying pattern, the ability to absorb, adapt, and continue, had been learned during the first great fusion of Roman and Gallic worlds. The army changed too. Celtic warriors who had once stood opposite the legionary shield wall now stood within it or in ranks beside it. They served as cavalry, scouts, skirmishers. Over time, their descendants would inherit not just their father's bravery, but Rome's organizational habits. The idea of permanent units, of ranks, of codified service. Long after Caesar's name had become a title rather than a memory, the military culture that grew out of these hybrids would shape how wars were fought in Western Europe. Disciplined formations led by elites who traced their sense of honor to both Roman and older warrior codes. When people later spoke of the conquest of Gaul, it sounded almost simple. 8 years, a series of campaigns, a general victorious. The reality was far more profound. In those years, tribal independence was not only defeated on the battlefield, it was dismantled as a political system. In its place grew new forms of organization, towns under Roman law, provinces under governors, local elites woven into imperial networks. Celtic identities did not vanish, but they were forced to live inside new shapes. The wealth taken from Gaul helped turn a republic into an empire. The institutions built to control Gaul outlived the empire that created them. Cities, roads, legal habits, patterns of landholding, even the idea of what it meant to rule a territory. All of these passed into the medieval kingdoms that rose when Rome itself fractured. In those kingdoms, Frankish, Burgundian, Aquitanian, and others, you can still see the echo. Roman roads beneath medieval carts, Roman city grids beneath winding alleys, Latin law codes reshaped to fit Germanic kings, Christian churches standing where once Druids had held sacred groves. And beneath all of that, older still, there is the memory of the tribes that once resisted. Of Helvetii burning their homes, of Belgic warriors standing in their thousands, of Veneti ships battling in Atlantic storms, of Amberix fading into the forests, of Vercingetorix riding down from Alesia in full armor to surrender for the sake of his people. The world that rose from their defeat was not the world they had fought for, but the world that came after, the Europe of medieval towns, frontier kingdoms, hybrid cultures, and layered identities, was in part built on the foundations laid by Rome in Gaul and reshaped by the stubborn endurance of the people Rome thought it had conquered forever.